Hello, everybody. Happy New Year, and welcome to another edition of the Best of Pedalshift. On this edition, we go all the way back to October 29th, 2020 to talk about bike touring packing strategies. You got a bike, you know where you're going. The next biggest thing is what to bring and where and how to pack it. These are my top 5 strategies for packing your bike on bike tour. Hope you enjoy. On this edition, we're going to do my top 5 bike tour packing strategies. Is this something that I always think about? No. Maybe if somebody was asking me packing advice, I think that any of these things would be things that I would share. So let's just jump right into it. Number 1, there is no particular order to any of this. Number 1 is you really want waterproof storage with an asterisk. I think that waterproof storage is a really important thing, whether you are a traditional bike tourer with the full pannier setup or you're more into a bike packing scenario. I think that I throw an asterisk there if you are going to find yourself in a situation where you're just starting out and you don't have access to waterproof bags, or you are going on a ride in a desert situation or a place where you're just absolutely not going to have any chance of rain whatsoever. Other than that, I think that you want to make sure that you've got waterproof storage. Now, that does not necessarily mean that you need Ortlieb back rollers and the uniform, as I like to call it sometimes, or some really expensive bike packing bags. And they can be really expensive. But there are plenty of really good options out there that are waterproof in nature, that aren't the big brands, and you can work your way up. And you can even use gear that you already have. Maybe you've got a backpack that you can throw a waterproof cover over, or any of the variety of things that are out there. Waterproof dry bags are really inexpensive. That plus a bungee or a strap or something like that, and you're in great shape. The other thing is that you don't necessarily need all of your storage to be waterproof, just your key storage, stuff to keep things like your sleeping kit and your clothes dry. You know, your tent doesn't necessarily have to be kept dry the whole time, so pick and choose your battles where you need to go. One other thing about waterproofness, it doesn't have to be the exterior of your bags that's always waterproof. You can waterproof internally. And I know from a backpacking perspective, most backpacks are really, frankly, not very waterproof. What happens is that most backpackers, especially the long-term, big trail, triple crown type of hikers, they'll tend to waterproof stuff on the inside. So they'll have big trash bags inside that they'll seal up. So the exterior of your bag can get as wet as possible. Yeah, maybe water is going to get through, but the interior, you've got liners that are going to make sure that your other stuff inside your bags stays dry. Frankly, I think that that's not a terrible idea. Just double redundancy, which is in and of itself a redundant sentence. You know, if you've got electronics or things that absolutely must be kept dry, you know, double wrap things. Have an internal waterproof bag inside another waterproof bag. That's always a really good idea. But generally speaking, I can tell you from personal experience that it's incredibly important to have and keep things dry. When you're in a deluge and you're able to get to your endpoint, whether that's a hotel or a campsite or whatever, to be able to open up your bags and have the knowledge and ability to say, okay, I know that I'm going to be able to get into dry clothes. I know my sleeping bag is going to be dry. I know that I've got my electronics are going to be protected in there. Really important peace of mind, because when you're riding and you're not sure that your stuff is staying dry, trust me, it gets in between your ears really quickly. So that's number 1. You really want waterproof storage with an asterisk. Number 2, bike touring life is all about balance. No, this isn't me going all yoga on you again. It's basically saying that however you pack up, you want to make sure that your load is balanced properly. And this can be a matter of personal preference. If you're riding with different loads on the front and the back of your bike, there are a lot of people that want the vast majority of their weight on the front of the bike. There are some people that only put the weight on the back of the bike, and they don't even have any kind of front panniers or front platform like I do on my larger touring rig. So I think it's a question about personal preference, but you really do want to find that balance. One thing that I would definitely say you'll notice if you're riding, especially if you've got front panniers, if you have a weight distribution problem between the left and the right side, you're really going to notice that. I think you notice it to a certain extent in the rear panniers as well, if you're going that route. And that can really throw you off. That's going to become much more acute of a problem if you are going down some really big hills. You will notice a lot of problems with your bike when you're going down after a gigantic climb. You'll notice all the wobbles that you don't really notice. You'll notice that the weight distribution will throw you off as well. And that can, especially if you're going at a really elevated speed down a gigantic hill, sometimes I know that I'm getting up to 40 miles per hour, 35, 40 miles per hour. That's pretty damn fast. And if you are off balance, off kilter with how you've packed your bags, that can be really problematic. What's my approach? The typical stuff where you put most of the heavy stuff in the bottom of the bags, that keeps your weight low on the bike. I think that's really important. To the extent that I can get anything that's on the heavier side in the middle of the bike, like right along the frame, I try to do that as possible. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll have heavier stuff if I'm carrying. It's not typical, but I've done it before. That'll actually sit on my rear rack in line with the frame of the bike, parallel with the bike. So it's sitting right above the frame. That might not necessarily always be the right choice because that's pretty high up and you tend to want to have heavy stuff down low, but that might be the right choice for what you are doing there. Folks who are doing more bike packing rigs, you take advantage of things being in line with the frame very often anyways, but frankly, you're not carrying a lot of really heavy stuff if you're in a bike packing rig. But no matter what you do, try to make sure that everything is relatively evenly distributed across the bike and down the bike. With, again, an emphasis on keeping your weight low. Low center of gravity is your friend when you are bike touring, and you've got to make sure that you're doing that with a mind when you are packing things together. So that's number 2. Bike touring life is all about balance. Number 3. Luxury item versus too many clothes. This is the distillation of sort of my contradictory advice when it comes to packing for a bike tour. I think it's incredibly important that you have some kind of a luxury item that absolutely makes no sense, that is the last thing that many people would choose to bring with them on a bike tour. For me, sometimes, and I've talked about this on the show before, I bring this gigantic stove and this big green propane tank. I call it the Green Dragon. And why do I bring it? Because, man, it boils water in a heartbeat. And sometimes if I'm not carrying a lot of extra stuff, but I am going fully loaded for whatever reason, man, I'll throw that thing in there. It is too heavy, too bulky, and ridiculous compared to my other options that I have stove-wise. But sometimes it's the right choice for me. And you may have that kind of a thing too. Maybe you want to bring a gigantic hardcover book with you. I would probably never do something like that because I don't really do hardcover books anymore. I kind of do Kindle books or electronic books or PDFs or whatever that I read on my phone, which I'm taking anyways, but you may want that hardcover book with you. That's great. Bring that. Have that luxury item with you, especially if it's going to make your tour all that much better. Now, let's contrast that with contradictory advice. Leave some of your clothes at home. Seriously, I'm serious here. I think I've talked about this before. I still, years later, bring too many clothes on every single freaking trip I go on because I'm always thinking, well, what if this one gets wet? Or what if this one gets dirty? Or what if I run out of? And 99 times out of 100, that just doesn't happen. Or you can reuse clothes, or you can layer up. The one thing that I tend to do the most is when the weather gets colder, I tend to bring way too many bulky layers. And the reality is that I should probably just layer up the extra clothes that I have. It's going to be fine. Frankly, also, when I'm riding, I'm rarely wearing more than one layer in almost all but the coldest and craziest conditions. I bring too many clothes, and you probably will too, especially if you're on your first tour. You're going to overplan and overthink things. Yes, you definitely want to have rain gear, for sure. all the time. If you are not in the asterisks area like I did in point 1, you definitely are going to want rain gear. But you know what? You're going to find you rewear a lot of your clothes way more often than you ever would in normal polite society. Trust me on this. And as you start to go, you'll find that you like a certain set of clothing to ride in way better than some alternate set that you have with you. And that alternate set is going to end up at the bottom of your panniers for most of the time that you continue riding. And if you go on a multi-day, multi-week tour, you're going to realize that at the end of the tour that you, well, brought too many clothes. And I think that that's the number one area for most people when we go out touring, that we overpack in that area. It can be bulky, and generally it's unnecessary. So many people I notice who are really struggling with how much they're packing, it tends to be clothes in the first instance. So contradictory advice. Leave some of your clothes at home, but make sure you bring a luxury item as well. That's number 3. Number 4, pack for your trip, not someone else's. You know, you're listening to a podcast by somebody who talks a lot about bike touring, but mostly about my trips. And I think that I hope, at least, that when I give this kind of a list or the kind of advice that I often give, that you're taking it with a grain of salt, because often I'm talking about my trips and what I do. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to fit the type of trip that you have. I ride a particular type of bike. Well, 2, really. I mean, I've got the Brompton related trips, which are entirely different types of trips, entirely different type of packing than I do on my Navarro Safari. They're just different bikes. It's different trips. Where you're going, what you're doing, what the time of year is. Are you camping? Are you doing mostly in and maybe keeping camping as a backup? I mean, all these things are factors that are really going to change how you pack. When you signed up, which hopefully you have, signed up for my email list, which I haven't sent out an email in like 6 months. That's a longer story. Point being, when you signed up for that, you got a packing list. And that packing list might have been very helpful for you. Or you looked at it and said, I use nothing like this at all. And this isn't terribly helpful. You know, use pack lists that you get from a place like me or a place like any of the other variety of different folks out there that are putting up ideas on bike touring. You know, grain of salt with all of that. Yes, what I choose to bring is based on my experience, but also my style and what I'm riding with and where I typically tend to go and what I typically tend to do on my trips. Your trip is very likely going to differ in some way, shape, or form where you're going to deviate from what I end up, suggesting. So make sure that you pack for your trip, not someone else's. That's number 4. Number 5, do not wing it. Make a list. I have on a few occasions gone on a bike tour and I was positive I had something in my pannier that I needed for a particular moment in my tour. And I reached in there and I couldn't find it. And then I got frustrated and thought, oh, it must be in the other pannier. And I reached in and it wasn't there. And then I dump everything out and then I look for it and I realize, you know what? I left it at home. Or I lost it. But more likely, I left it at home. And in most of those cases, I left it at home. I have bought on the road so many lightning cables for charging my phone. I have lost track. You've probably heard about it on a bunch of the tour journals because I know I've done it on major tours that I've documented on the pod. It's because frankly, I've gotten to the point where I get a little lazy sometimes and I think, oh, I can just pull this all together. I keep all my bike touring stuff in one spot. I'll be able to do it. And then I forget something big. Somebody who really, really relies on my iPhone when I tour. Sometimes I need it for navigations, but most of the time it's for taking pictures. It's for documenting. It's for recording podcasts. It's a really important device. And it might be great that I've got a backup battery to charge from over time. But if I don't have a lightning cable, well, it's not really helpful. Sidebar, I actually bought a battery that I can do wireless Qi charging off of it onto my iPhone because specifically I keep forgetting lightning cables. Wireless charging for the win for dummies like me. But that doesn't mean that you should wing it. You should not wing it. You should make a list every single time and make sure that you've got everything with you before you go on your tour. I don't care if you're leaving from your front door, your garage, or you're flying around the world to start your tour. It's so important to make sure that you've got a list and you've got everything together. It may be that you're making a list of stuff that you're bringing in one place and that you're actually going to acquire in another. I know that's really true when I've flown out to the West Coast. I'm not bringing my food with me on the plane. No, I get all of that at a Safeway or another grocery store or a corner store or whatever somewhere on the West Coast. So I have a separate list for all of that, strategies for what I'm going to do food wise. But I make a list, and now I sometimes don't. And when I wing it, I screw things up. So don't be like me. Make a list. Don't buy your 15th lightning cable. I have so many lightning cables. So folks, those are my top 5 bike tour packing strategies. To sum it all up, number 1, you really want waterproof storage, asterisk, sometimes you don't necessarily need it. Number 2, bike touring life is all about balance. Make sure you have things weighted properly. Number 3, luxury items versus too many clothes. Leave some of your clothes at home, but bring a luxury item. Number 4, pack for your trip, not for somebody else's. I am doing a different ride than you are probably, and you should pack for your ride, not mine. And number 5, do not wing it. Make a list. Do not be like me when it comes to lists, because sometimes I make them and sometimes I don't. And when I don't, I suffer for it. So that's it. Pretty short show this week, but I do want to close with one thing for those of you who are in the United States and you are registered to vote. Please go out and vote. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, but vote for the folks that you like. Vote for the issues that you like. Just go out and vote. Thanks. Thank you for joining. You can find Pedalshift at pedalshift.net for more great bicycle touring content. You can hear the Pedalshift project through Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his self-titled album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Mono Mono, wherever cool music